do. But one of the main things is that I do work around something called emergent strategy. Emergent strategy. So instead of strategy, as we've been taught through sort of military lineage, as trying to come up with what is the best plan to dominate and win and move forward, emergent strategy is based in the concepts of nature, right? Emergence. And Octavia's leaders all have this. We have to be adaptive, relational, decentralized, interconnected, interdependent. So that exercise is one we've been doing all over the country with different groups of organizers, activists, artists, and other things like collective sci-fi writing, visioning. And the idea is to move people from a place of strategy that is designed to win to strategy that is designed to emerge and evolve. How do we put ourselves in right relationship with nature? And then reading Octavia helps us. And I just want to shout out the NOLA crew who took the bus here. This is our Wild Seeds Coven from New Orleans, who are meeting and reading Octavia's poetry.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. That was so beautiful and so healing. I feel stress rolling off. Our other panelists, feel free to speak in any order you like. Just a little bit about why you're here. What did you say when you talked about what you wanted to change, or just a little bit about yourself? Or
I'm going to keep getting my Bible really bad back, so I always feel weird. It always seems like we catch a spirit or something. But I want to thank everyone who made this possible. I want to thank my fellow panelists. It's a great honor to be here with all of you. And everyone who came out. I can only imagine some of you, what you gave up to come here. Folks came up on the bus. Damn. That's no joke, man. Yeah, man. I really appreciate it. And of course, to our fearless leader, Professor Joe. Honestly, I mean, I feel like if we had like 3 of you, this shit would be a wrap. You know? So I guess very quickly, my name is Juno Diaz. I'm a writer, and I think part of what sort of brought me here both has to do with sort of the time I came out of 45. So if you do the math, I came up during the time that Octavia Butler's books were being published. Her books were coming out basically as I was, coming of age. And in many ways, the zeitgeist that informed, what's happening in the world, that informed a lot of her books, we were sort of those of us who were alive at that time who were not only coming out of that same sort of historical movement, historical moment, but I think found ourselves in many ways reflected in her books in ways that we weren't reflected anywhere else. I was one of those, what they call an early adapter. A doctor? They go to a doctor? Yeah, I can never get it right. Is it? Yeah, whatever. I was reading her young, completely because I had a really awesome librarian now because I was particularly smart. And I think that part of the reason I come here not only has to do with the fact that historical moment, that zeitgeist, which Octavia Butler was both responding to and speaking with, in many ways produced me as an activist. I have a sideline that I'm a writer, but really for most of my, you could say most of my quote-unquote career, I was an activist. Most of my friends were shocked to find out that I was a writer because they just knew me as somebody who you know, we throw around the word genocidal, but I mean, the United Nations is not particularly known as a very liberal organization, and even they have designated those wars as genocidal. And I grew up in a neighborhood where a lot of the folks who were coming out in many ways as sort of the victims of those wars were washing up in our neighborhoods. A lot of people who had been driven out, people in exile, a lot of people had to flee their communities that had been bombed and burned out. And at the same time, this was the Reagan period, the urban double nightmare of crack and AIDS. And I grew up in a poor community, predominantly African American, Latino, and sort of was watching this stuff and living this stuff front lines. And in many ways, my activism comes as a response to all of these things, both my sense of internationalism, but also, you know, my deep, deep commitment to the continuities of our civil rights movements and our feminist movements and our third world feminist movements. And a lot of these things, again, I found myself in many ways my Bible and my mirror and my song and my friend and my pen and my vehicle were the works of Octavia Butler in a very powerful way. And just to finish up, I think one of the things that continues to haunt me always to this day is that I had, like many of our panelists, I had met Octavia Butler a number of times through my friendship with Samuel Delaney. But the one time that I was supposed to interview Octavia Butler, do a long, long interview with her, I showed up to the place where we were supposed to be interviewing, and I could not find her. And she showed up to a place, and she could not find me. And we both spent an hour in two different places looking for each other. And we never met. And we were never able to do that interview. Even though I had met her and I knew her, the interview continues to haunt sort of like my dreams. I have so many dreams, for real, where I am interviewing Octavia Butler. It's an interview that never happened. And I often think that most of us, whether we've read her or have not read her without knowing it, are living that moment, which is, what would Octavia say next? What would Octavia write next? And what would it mean just to spend a little time in a conversation with such a towering, important figure to African diasporic veterans? And so I think of that, and I think part of the reason I'm here is because in the echoes of our dialogue, I really kind of hoping to hear her again, as always. You know?
My name is Dream Hampton. Like Juno, I'm a couple years younger than him. I grew up reading Octavia as she kind of came out. When Parable was released, I can remember, this was back when there were black bookstores. You may have heard of them. That they used to be a real thing. And in New York, well, actually in Detroit, I think I bought it at the Shrine of the Black Madonna. I was home for a visit. And I remember reading, like buying it, but not wanting to get in my car to drive home. I wanted to start reading it then, like I didn't. So I sat in the store until they closed and began reading Parable of the Store at the bookstore. Octavia's always meant a great deal to me. I absolutely identified with Lauren Olamina at the time. I think that by that time I had tried out, like a prisoner, you know, I had tried out a bunch of different religions. You know how your cousins and brothers go to prison and then they like discover the Nation of Islam and then they discover real Islam and then they may become a Rasta or something. Like I had gone through that whole journey and was questioning, you know, what I believed in terms of spirituality. So that book was a huge, just a lamp for me in terms of writing a particular path. I mean, everything that Juno said about our generation and its zeitgeist, absolutely. I mean, I went to DC as a gas station when I was 11 with my own handmade sign at Shell. I didn't know then that like the people who own the individual station aren't Shell. But Shell was the only, well not the only, but one of the more visible companies who refused to divest from South Africa. And because Stevie Wonder had told me it was terrible. And you know, of course that's how I learned about apartheid, and because of Winnie and her strong and courageous voice and tours, and that's how I learned about her husband, and went on to read Pico, and just that entire education. So yeah, I was standing up in the freezing cold in Detroit with my sign that you shouldn't buy gas here because they support apartheid. And I remember people from Detroit being like, what's apartheid? And like I was like telling them, you know. So that was my very first action. By the time Miracle had come around, I was in New York. I was a film student at NYU. I was largely at NYU because of Kubrick's 2001. A film that had also been very important for me growing up. I was at film school, but I was also in a city that was dealing with incredibly severe like militarization, and they were experimenting on black bodies in terms of how they would spread this militarization throughout different police departments. In fact, this summer, the NYPD will be coming to Detroit to teach them how to stop and frisk. It wasn't called stop and frisk then, but we were dealing with incredible police brutality in the early 90s in Detroit. And some friends and I founded the New York chapter of an organization called the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, which is of course very active here in Atlanta. And as I was reading Parable, I was trying to imagine new ways to be a phrase that we use in Detroit, leaderful, you know, to break out of like hierarchical patterns, because at that point we had our elders who were kind of mentoring us, beautiful people like Chokwe Lumumba, the late mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, who were mentoring us, but we also were seeing that they had beefs, that some of them, they didn't talk to like some organization that they had beef with over some COINTELPRO stuff in the 70s. And, you know, we'd see each other at a Yusuf Hawkins march and they'd be ready to fight still. You know, so we were trying to imagine ways to break out of those old paradigms. And Octavia's work, again, was important to me. Back in Detroit, is anyone here from Detroit? I know my boy Spot is from Detroit. We used to have a DJ called Mojo. As you know, Elijah Muhammad imagined that there was this mothership that would take us all to another galaxy. And Elijah, and of course Elijah Muhammad began the Nation of Islam in Detroit. But we had this DJ, Mojo, who founded Prince in a lot of ways, and Prince gives him credit for that. And he would have these like late night shows about the mothership landing. And I was so young, I used to really stay out super late. I mean, 8 years old, up at like 2 in the morning looking for the mothership. So, I mean, I don't know, that's a little bit about my history, where I'm here. I always think about truth, and when I think about my generation, which of course brought us hip hop, I think about just the limitations of what truth is and what keeping it real can mean. And I think about Sun Ra, who says that, you know, what I'm dealing with is so vast and great that it can't be called the truth, it's above the truth. So all of those things I bring to this panel, and I look forward to this discussion. And Dr. Du, my God, you're like Alice Walker to Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, the work, the caretaking that you've done about Octavia's legacy is so inspiring, and thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I was been in dialogue with her actually for the last year or two, because again, I co-adapted McKinley's graphic novel, so trying to live with this woman's words and to really try to kind of differentiate some of the different connotations of that particular narrative, which is such a powerful story, has been an honor, and I'm very excited about working on that project. I'm sorry, I also don't talk loud. Sorry. I was thinking about James Baldwin's quote, "Artists are here to disturb the peace," right? I teach my students how to be disturbing. You know, I always tell them, like, I want to educate you, but I want to recognize you as well. I'm from Mississippi. I was born in 1970 in shadow of a lot of the racialized violence that happened in the South, right? And so I'm kind of a unicorn. I'm not supposed to be here, as Adrienne was talking about. You know, like we've all gone through particular struggles. One of the things that led me to education was the fact that my grandfather was, you know, totally illiterate, right? Believed in the power of education, but actually couldn't read or write himself, and actually used an X. I know it sounds very cliche, but he actually used an X to sign his name, right? And so when I think about like the opportunities that he could have had, I started to imagine what his life would have been like. You know, I actually still do this if, you know, he actually had access to those types of spaces, right? So I started to create, you know, these types of narratives very early on. My mother was a huge science fiction and fantasy reader. I'm actually really horror too. She totally ruined me very early on. And she was one of my first artists that actually that I was inspired by. She made quilts and dresses, and actually at the time I was like, oh, that's girl stuff. That's not how, you know. But no, she's an artist, right? And so was my grandmother, who also was actually very much into these like traditional folklore traditions that are kind of like rooted in particular diasporic, you know, culture, right? That I didn't recognize at the time. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing recently, I've been delving into those areas. I'm a curator. I'm also, you know, a cultural critic, and I do a lot of like edited pieces on representation of popular culture. One of the things that I really am inspired by Octavia's work is she talks in some of her interviews I've seen. I've never had the opportunity to actually physically meet her, but she talks about writing herself into a space that she loved that actually didn't represent her, right? And so this notion of the power of representation is something I'm very, very into. I teach a class called Semiotics and Visual Rhetoric at the University of Buffalo, which is about the science of understanding images, right? And so last year I taught this class called Race as Science Fiction. And so basically exposed my students to this notion of this kind of fictionalized idea of what race is and how it designates you know, different types of hierarchies, right? And this is mostly, you know, white and Asian class, right? But there were 8 black students in the class, which is a lot for an art class in that space. And so to see the dynamic shift as far as to see a class that actually is focused on their, you know, on their spaces, on their ideas, which is extremely powerful. Some of the things I've been into recently, besides doing graphic novels and such, I also organize and facilitate spaces as well. Recently I did this piece with Dr. Adrienne Maree Brown called Astral Blackness, which some of the people on the panel work. Thank you so much. Which was basically talking about these issues around you know, black spiritual spaces and, you know, these notions of like, you know, agency and representation. I'm also very much into social entrepreneurship, using these ideas to kind of empower people through different modes of entrepreneurship. When I was at the University of Illinois, I actually co-created this class called EDGE, which is an acronym for Ethics of Designer in a Global Economy. And I really believe in training designers, because a lot of you guys probably like know what a graphic designer is, but you know, we shape and sculpt, you know, the visual landscape. It's a social space, right? And so a lot of times, you know, we are kind of hired to be like graphic go-boys and go-girls, where you're just kind of creating these things for a client. But we have agency, and I'm really big this idea of like the artist as author, you know, so authorship, citizenship, and creating this notion of the citizen designer is something I'm related to as well. And so a lot of my work is dealing with really imagining those particular spaces, and then what can kind of transpire once you actually open the door to students about that type of things. So, and that's why I'm here. I'm very thankful to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I think for me, I would have had a very hard time getting here if it weren't for Octavia Butler. That's why I'm really glad to see myself here. The reason why I say that is because when I first started writing, I discovered Octavia in the year of 2000. And before that, I'm a direct product of creative writing programs. I started writing when I was 20. And in those classes, my professors knew early on that I had a gift for storytelling, but at the same time, like I said, I'm a product of creative writing program, so those professors were discouraging me from writing science fiction and fantasy. They kept saying, you know, we want you to write real literature. You can write real literature, don't write that other stuff, with the weird stuff in it. So, for years, I was struggling with that. The weird stuff kept wanting to pop up in my work. It naturally did. And my professors kept suppressing it. And then in the year 2000, I went to a science fiction and fantasy workshop called the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Workshop. It's a 6-week, it's still going. The one that I went to was at Michigan State University, and it's 6 weeks long, and each week has a different professor, or a different instructor. And in one of those weeks, Steve Barnes happens to be one of the instructors as well, which is cool. So during that 6 weeks, out of, I think there were about maybe 19 or 20 students, or 19 or 20 writers in this workshop, and I and one other writer were the only black people in my group. So there was that. And as that was happening, you know, so we would have we workshop different stories every single day and all of that. So there were certain issues, like the issue of the magical Negro, popped up during these workshops. And because of the way the group was structured, things weren't discussed, except during Steve's week. Things weren't properly discussed. So we had all these things going on. We had my whole creative writing workshop experience going on. And so this was the first time I was trying to see if I was really a science fiction and fantasy writer. So during the time where I was at the workshop, we went to the bookstore. And I was going through the science fiction and fantasy section. I go through all the sections in the bookstore, so eventually I made it to the science fiction and fantasy section, and I saw a book with I saw a very big rarity in that section. And it had the cover facing out. I stopped and looked at this cover in awe because it had a black person on the cover. I had no idea who Octavia Butler was at the time. This was 2000 once again. And I bought that book. That's the power of covers. I bought that book. And I took it to my dorm room and started reading. And the book that I bought was Wild Seed. It's called Wild Seed. And I started reading, and I'm of Nigerian background, and Wild Seed started in Nigeria. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, like, oh, you know. So there are two things that I couldn't believe that were happening here. It was like, first you got the black person on the cover, then it's taking place in Nigeria, and I was like, my head was exploding already. And so I ended up reading that book probably within that week, while I was supposed to be writing other stories, but I was reading that. And so when I finished reading that book, my mind was stretched so much that it was, you know when you stretch something and it never returns in the same shape it was before? That's what Wild Seed did for me, and because it was just doing so many things I'd never seen done before. And as a young black writer of whatever I was writing, science fiction, fantasy, whatever, reading something like that, seeing those kinds of characters, telling that kind of story was earth-shattering for me. It was, not only was it a great story, not only was it just, you know, that kind of book that reads so smoothly, you lose yourself in it. So not only was there that, but just to see those images as a writer was deeply affecting to me. It showed me that it was okay to write what I was writing. Because up until that point, I had never seen anyone else doing it. And there's something to be said about that. To be able to see someone else doing what you hope to do, it's like, it just gives you this sort of permission that I didn't have before. So that was like the beginning of so much for me, just discovering that book. And of course, after that, a few things happened. One, I went on to grab anything else that she'd written and consume it like candy. So I did that, but also I had been holding the book, and one of my instructors had looked at it and said, oh, she taught at this workshop. And me being who I am, very aggressive sometimes, I said, can I talk to her? Can you get her on the phone? And so that led to my first conversation with Octavia. And so, so over the years, you know, I had like, there were on and off conversations that I'd have with her every so often for different reasons. And one of them that I most remember was about, a year later, right after 9/11 happened, we were both online and I had her email address and we were exchanging emails as that was happening, and just kind of talking about what we thought was going to happen and what we thought was happening. And I remember that she did not have good things to say about President Bush, was one. She had terrible things to say about him. And then also, we were both very pessimistic, you know, and I kept those conversations, and those were eventually published in an anthology, which name I can't remember right now. But, so there's that, and then eventually I got to meet her in person when she came to Chicago State University. I think it was months before she passed. And she came to speak there, and I always remember that because one, of course, I got to meet her in person and we had a nice little conversation, but what I most remember was Chicago State it's not officially a historically black university, historically black university, but it is a black university, it really is. And it's on the south side of Chicago, So, so when she came, what was so heartening was that it was during the Gwendolyn Brooks Writers Conference when they used to have it, and when she came to speak, it was packed. That room was packed with all of these people who loved her. And it was wonderful to see that, because there are times where I feel like she went through a lot as a science fiction writer. She was such a pioneer, and when you're a pioneer of something, you just deal with things. There's a loneliness that I know she had to suffer. I know she had to suffer. We've all seen those book covers where they whitewashed her book covers, and can you imagine what she had to, she didn't have anyone really other than Chip Delaney to share that experience with. So it was probably very lonely. And so when she spoke at Chicago State, it was just a beautiful thing to see this room packed with all of these black people who were just admiring her. Everyone just wanted to claw on her and just be like, "We love you so much." It was really beautiful. And for me, I love to see. I wonder if she understood just how much she was loved before she passed, because a lot of her accolades seem to come after she passed, and I mean, she of course had many before that, but I think she just did not. I don't think she knew just how much her work was loved by so many different people. So that's really my experience with